Okay, so we're going to start chapter 3 here. This is the unit chapters 1 through 3, and chapter 3 deals with supply. And again, when we're talking about demand, we're talking about more of the customer's viewpoint, what the customers want, what the customers demand. And so hence they call it demand. Again, McDonald's every year comes out with the McRib sandwich. Evidently people, want it. I've tried it once. It was very barbecuey, so if you're into that, in that case, it wasn't too terrible. That said, the people themselves would not get the McRib all the time. So what McDonald's does is, and it's brilliant on their part, they only release it for just a little bit. It's like the Shamrock Shakes, which are absolutely disgusting and deplorable. They only release them during a certain time, and people will want them. And so, what we're talking about here is the idea of demand and supply, how they work together. But demand was what the customers wanted, supply is what the producers produce. And what we're talking about with supply, the definition here is the amount of goods. Remember, goods are like shakes, tennis shoes, hoodies, belts, all sorts of products like that, and services, doctors, lawyers, mechanics, dentists, eye doctors, amount of goods and services businesses are willing and able to provide at different prices. So obviously, if you're a business, you want to make as much money as possible. That there's nothing wrong with that. You want to do well. However, when you're doing this, you have to be able to figure out that price by which people are going to continue to buy your product. If your price is too high, as the manufacturer, people will not buy it. Now, some people may be able to afford it, the most wealthy class, but you want the common people to be able to afford your product, and that's going to allow you to sell more things. So, supply is dealing with the producers, the manufacturers. Demand is dealing with the consumers. And here's the law of supply: the higher the prices buyers are willing to pay, the greater the quantity of the product a supplier will produce. So if you as a manufacturer realize that you could charge $1 and tons of people want it, then maybe you're going to etch it up the next year to $1.50 and people will still want it. You go up to $2 and people are still craving it. You get up to 3, 4, 5, and people are still looking for your product. People are still wanting your product. See, you're going to continue to produce more and more items because you want those things flying off the shelf, and you also want people to invest in your company by buying your products, and you want to make more money. And that's the law of supply. Now, if you remember, the law of demand was the lower the price, the more people will want it. This is dealing with the side of things, which is from the manufacturer. The higher the prices buyers are willing to pay, the greater the quantity of the product a supplier will produce. So we're going to get into some charts and graphs again, so I'm going to exit out of this in just a second. And the first thing we're going to talk about is what we call a supply schedule, okay? So we'll talk about a supply schedule, and then, so I would, in your notes if you want, maybe leave a decent-sized blank here, and then we'll get to number 2, the supply curve. So I'm going to keep this on there so you kind of see where we're at, but we're going to go to some charts, very similar to what the charts we covered just yesterday were. So let's escape out of this. And what you'll notice here is on this side of things, let me move this stuff around here. So this right here, okay, this stuff right here, the price of Coke, the amount supplied, this is your supply schedule, okay, this top part. Don't just ignore this area down here. So this is your supply schedule. Now notice 75 cents, they provided 1,000 cups for the price of Coke. But then they realized that at $1, people were still craving the product, so they supplied more cups. $1.25, people were still craving it, and they looked at 3,000, so they started supplying 3,000 cups. At $1.50, you had 4,000 people craving the product. $1.65, 5,000, $2. So what do you think they're going to keep doing? Naturally, this business, McDonald's, is going to continue to charge more so that people will continue to crave it. But if they go too high, then all of a sudden this number stays flat. Let's say they go up to 275 and it still stays at 5,000, then they're going to need to lower their price if they're going to want people to do this. So this is the supply schedule. Notice this number goes up, and so does this number. It's the opposite of what demand was, where this number would go up and this number would go down. And so again, this is the number supplied. So what we're going to do here is we're going to graph this out. Now, if you notice on this graph, what you're going to do is you're going to put the number of the quantity supplied down here, and then you're going to put the price. Now, right now, the way this is set up, it's going to adjust in just a second. It's going by 25s. But notice we don't really have a product here yet. Well, actually, I'm sorry, we do. I put it at 7,000 for $2. But let's say you go like this. Now, we type in $1.75 at 6,000, and you're going to start noticing this chart. So you put in the next one at $1.50. What's going to happen? It's going to keep going down, and you can imagine what the rest of this is going to look like. $1.25 at 4,000, and then you just follow your supply schedule. Actually, I think my numbers are slightly off, but that's okay. You'll get the idea. Let me put this in here at $1, and then put this in here at 75 cents, and then you put this in here at 50 cents. And so what do you notice about this line? Again, it starts lower here, and presumably if you are selling a product for barely any money, why would you keep selling the product? So notice your line here is going from this area all the way up. Now, if you guys remember, which way would your demand line go? We'll do this chart probably tomorrow, but your demand, remember, the higher the price, the less people want it. So your demand, and again I have this in blue, we'll do this tomorrow, but I just want to focus on supply, but demand would go this way. But supply goes this way. They're going to continue to charge more if more people want the product. This is the idea behind what we would call a supply curve. So again, your numbers here, obviously this would be 0.0. There's be 0, 0, 0 sold, 0 cost, and then you build from there. So price goes up here, quantity goes there. Obviously, if you inverted these, you would have kind of a little bit of a mess, but it would still probably tell the story. But in years past, I've seen kids put $2 here and put $0 here. That doesn't make any sense because this is the point absolute zero. Okay, so that is the law of supply. And so now let's get into why does supply change? And so why does supply change? Letter C. We talked about why demand changed, but let's focus on the supply side. Again, supply deals primarily with the manufacturers themselves. And as they deal with primarily the manufacturers themselves, let's talk about why supply could change. Now, this is kind of slowing down here, so hopefully it changes in just a second. Okay, number one, a change in technology. Think about this from the business manufacturer side of things. You know, the old school computers that they created in the 1950s were ginormous. I mean, these things were so crazy expensive and were huge. And then you think about, like, your phone is basically like a computer now. You pretty much have a computer in your pocket. And so a change in technology can dramatically shift supply. Because you think about it, a manufacturer once would have to charge, you know, almost $2,000 or whatever for a computer that was ginormous. But nowadays, they can make a Chromebook for pretty cheap. And it does the same functions, if not more functions in that. And that mainly is because technology changed. They were able to make component parts that were smaller. They were able to make screens that were easier. You know, the keypad. All of those things have changed technology. And the same amount of money that producers once spent to manufacture, you know, a few early computers now allowed them to make many more modernized versions, and supplies increased rapidly. And then as a result of that, even prices begin to drop. And so for, you know, you think about what you could spend for a computer in the 1970s versus what you could spend in a computer now. You could probably buy 10 computers today for what you spent back in the 80s or 70s and trying to buy a personal computer back then. I think about like the cell phones and when cell phones first came out, how expensive those things were. But change in technology allowed them to shrink the phones down and perhaps save some more cost on things. Now, sometimes cost does go up in a little bit of this, but change in technology can definitely have an impact on the amount of supply that you're able to produce. the change in production costs. Now, as far as how much it would cost, sometimes a change in supply happens because production costs just keep going up. Let's say that there's a shortage of I don't know, iron ore or something like that that they would create for steel. If there's a shortage on that, then that would change your production cost. Or you think about like right now gas is super cheap, and what could happen is they figured out a way to drill cheaper oil and to refine oil a lot cheaper, and that would also change a production cost, and that would change how much supply you have out there. You think about like restaurants. Maybe there's a huge back in the day they had mad cow disease, literally cows that were being infected by various viruses and stuff. And so what ended up happening is the cost of beef went up tremendously. And so therefore production cost went up as well. Maybe the government puts more regulations on a particular company, and that also has an impact on production costs themselves. And then sometimes it's just a change in price of other goods. If you think about it, if all of a sudden, the industry, let's say, go back to the prohibition days when alcohol was illegal, and so therefore, maybe pop wasn't super popular, but then the change in price of alcohol went up because it was rare, and then it eventually became illegal. So what ended up happening? Well, then all of a sudden everybody wants to invest in pop and different things. So the change in price of other goods could actually have an impact on that. And so maybe you would have to change your price. Maybe you'd have to change the product that you are creating. So the change in price of other goods. So three reasons why supply changes: change in technology, change in production costs, and the change in price of other goods. So what we're going to do now is we're going to stop, and tomorrow we'll talk about your market equilibrium price. How does a business and the consumers, supply and demand, how do they figure out what they are willing to pay for the price of an item? Because it does depend on it. You've got to find a mutual ground by which the two groups stand on. If the products are too expensive, the consumers won't buy. If it's too cheap, then the producers won't produce. And so the market equilibrium price kind of deals with both the supply and demand, and we will show you that chart tomorrow. If you have any questions, let me